How's it going, everyone? I have noticed a trend growing stronger recently on Reddit, Twitch, YouTube, and Twitter for those who dare to enter, where Nurse is being used as sort of a trump card when it comes to talking about pretty much anything related to game balance in Dead by Daylight. So in this video, we're gonna be addressing whether or not her strength is the downfall of every other killer in the game. But first, I want to quickly talk about Nurse's future being directly linked to the upcoming change to Dead Hard. If Dead Hard's rework makes it ineffective, which I personally don't believe it's going to do, it will be a massive buff to Nurse unquestionably. Although it's true every killer may benefit from the Dead Hard change, the difference is it's often believed that Dead Hard is the only thing in the game giving survivors a fair chance against a good Nurse. We don't know how all the changes are going to feel in the upcoming mid-chapter, but I'm going to predict that this is true. I just don't see a future where behavior will allow the current Nurse and a version of Dead Hard that has the possibility to be less effective to exist together. Dead Hard has always been an incredibly unhealthy perk, and it does feel like the change to it was directly related to countering Nurse. It's possible that behavior may have accidentally even buffed the perk because of this. The only right answer was probably to delete the perk entirely. Let me know where you all stand on this. Can Nurse be effectively countered with no Dead Hard and a significantly weaker version of Iron Will as well? Now moving on to the broader point of the video, is Nurse holding game balance and design prisoner because of her level of strength? Basically, is she so powerful that no significant gameplay changes can be implemented, like an early game slowdown or stronger killer perks? Just a week ago, people said that they will never slow down generator speeds because of Nurse, but that clearly is not the case, as gens are about to take 10 seconds longer for both Survive with Friends and solo queue players. There's a lot of different angles to this argument from both sides. It is commonly believed that at the highest level of DBD with the highest skilled players, that Nurse is the only killer in the game that can actually compete. Every other killer needs to rely on camping, tunneling, or slugging to win a competitive match. However, the counter argument to this is that it is because Nurse fundamentally breaks the game. Both of those arguments can be true at the same time, which would be a sign of just how badly high-level DBD is balanced. Here's a popular comment from Reddit. A killer that's broken by design will always mess up the entire game balance. What they mean by this is basically, since Nurse is able to ignore looping entirely, playing against her is unfair. But at the same time, Nurse doesn't play like any other killer in the game. She has weaknesses to account for her strengths. The question is, does she have enough true counterplay, or is she only limited by the skill level of the killer player, not taking the survivor's experience into account? Super Alf recently got a 200 plus win streak with Nurse on his channel. He did this even with skill-based matchmaking being turned on, getting stream sniped by at least one competitive team who knew his exact build, and undoubtedly playing against a few subtle cheaters along the way as well. So if he's able to accomplish that, is it proof that she's too powerful? Well, one thing is at least reasonably true. Starstruck on Nurse is too strong. Now, behavior could go the route of nerfing a perk to account for Nurse's strength, but I think it would be much healthier to make Nurse's blink attacks not count as basic attacks. In fact, I think it's kind of weird that they do anyway. By the way, if you're a killer main, some of the rhetoric in this video probably sounds very familiar to you, because this same conversation has reappeared multiple times throughout DBD's lifespan. It once was Hex Ruin that was so strong that baseline gen speed couldn't be slowed down until it was nerfed. Then Hex Ruin got nerfed, and gen speed stayed exactly the same. Or how about how Spirit had absolutely no counterplay while she was using Strider, so behavior completely destroyed Strider, and then nerfed Spirit anyway afterwards. Or my personal favorite, Deathslinger, a horrifically overrated killer who had no counterplay because he could sometimes force survivors into option selects at very specific loops. Behavior's solution to this problem? Make it to where he aims 10 times slower and double the size of his tear radius too. Keep in mind, Trickster existed in the game at the same time. There is a very true element to DBD of survivor mains demanding killers get nerfed simply because they don't want to put the effort into learning more complex counterplay. And if you want to claim Nurse negatively affects game balance, then I think you need to equally accept that survivors' refusal to participate in more complex gameplay has had a similar effect. At some point, more nurse-like killers of some degree will need to be added in order for DBD to grow. You can only make so many killers that operate under the same set of rules. The prospect of a complete nurse rework would be setting the precedent that more elaborate killer design is unacceptable. On the flip side, there is an argument that she's actually way easier to play than killer mains would like you to believe. Before a week ago, I had personally never heard this, but now I've seen at least a dozen different people make the same exact claim. The thing about the argument I find a bit strange is it seems like nobody who is making this claim actually plays nurse. Likewise, a lot of people who say nurse is incredibly difficult to learn say they gave up trying to play her after a few frustrating matches, which is bad information as well. Fortunately, I saw two recent posts from alleged nurse mains about this. The first alleged nurse main said, "She was my main killer from her release until about 3 or 4 years into the game's life cycle." Alright, the first thing that comes to my mind is that since then I believe nurse has had a rework, and also skill-based matchmaking got added to the game, so those are two things you need to take into account. Moving on, she's not as hard as people like to act like she is, and gets a pass for being old. She is incredibly overpowered and holds the rest of the game back. No one likes playing against her unless it's a bad nurse, and the rarity of a god nurse argument has never applied since, first of all, most god nurses aren't even good at Dead by Daylight. They can't play the base game and instead play the single-player adventure known as the nurse game, where survivors are nothing but NPCs for someone's power fantasy. I'm not saying you're wrong at all, but I will say that that description sounds exactly what it feels like to play against a top-tier survive with friends. Like, exactly, word for word. Two wrongs don't make a right, and this is something that should not be in the game on either side in my opinion if all the players are the same skill level, obviously. He continues, "And secondly, because most nurses aren't great. They don't have to be. When you realize it's as simple as following a survivor with your first blink and then using the second one for corrections instead of trying to predict where a survivor is going, you can never be mind gamed with her again and pretty much get guaranteed hits." To me, that does sound like a little bit of an oversimplification, but I don't have enough personal experience playing nurse myself to make a real counter argument, so I'll leave that up to you guys in the comments. Considering that most nurses do that and most stack slowdown perks or insta-down perks and abuse her ridiculous add-ons, she is nowhere near as hard as people make her out to be and is genuinely problematic for the game. If it wasn't for her and Blight, to a lesser extent, we'd get smaller maps and we'd get stronger killer perks. I truly wish I could believe you on that, but just based on DBD's history, I don't see that as the outcome, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the video. The developers know they can't do anything against her, or the nurse players will throw a fit because they have to learn how to loop. It was funny watching them either get off the game for a couple of months while she was disabled, or get absolutely demolished at the most simple tiles even with several thousand hours because they never had to actually play the game. From a former nurse main, I despise this killer. She's the battle rifle of Dead by Daylight. She's the reason why I think Dead Hard should stay in the game. Dear developers, stop buffing her, at least make her blink hits count as a power attack instead of a basic. The last part I 100% agree with you on, I just don't see any reason that her blink attack should count as a basic attack. And listen, I do get what you're saying here, but I'm about to say something maybe a bit controversial. A lot of the loops in Dead by Daylight are so massively survivor favored that in order to get a hit at them, survivors have to make mistakes so large it's actually more hand-holding than anything you would find in almost every single player game. In a single player game, a developer would be like, that's too easy. In general, going forward, I hope Behavior does a better job in remembering that DBD is a multiplayer game and there are two sides, so gameplay should always be based around that idea. Now let's look at the next comment. "She is the strongest. As a nurse main for multiple years, I can tell you as an exchange for this power, you'll need to put hundreds of hours into her to get good. And many people underestimate that. They call us stupid for playing the best killer and say that nurse is easy because they won once at low rank. This nurse main has a completely different take, so if you're a high MMR nurse main as well, let us all know your truth. Against top tier survivors, do you feel like you're truly earning your victories, or are you just on autopilot, just slaughtering every team you play against with muscle memory?" They also raise a good point regarding the fact that DBD doesn't have any concrete way for players to self-evaluate. Every player's idea of their own skill level is completely based on their own perception. You can truly believe you're a top tier player but not actually be anywhere near the top level of MMR. A shocking amount of DBD players discussing balance changes still believe grades are a reflection of skill when they literally have nothing to do with it. Now, I don't play Nurse and I'm not that excited to play against her, but I do respect the fact that the person I'm playing against at least needs to use their brain in order to get value out of her. And I don't mind challenging myself to learn new ways to counter her unique abilities. Personally speaking, I think Behavior just needs to address her add-on issues, her synergy with certain perks like Starstruck that are too strong, and proceed cautiously. There's no need to overdo any changes, just make simple adjustments and see how the pieces come together before going further. When I asked you all about this, a lot of you agreed with me, but to my surprise, the same amount of you want Nurse completely reworked. The idea of a killer that ignores looping seems to be frustrating enough to the point where you would rather not have her in the game at all. I will say I recall when the last spirit complaints were getting more common before her big nerf, a lot of the arguments I saw back then were that at least Nurse takes skill, at least Nurse has to earn her victory, at least there's counterplay to Nurse. Those arguments seem to be gone now and the narrative has shifted. Of course, some people are just disingenuous and hate losing, but I think there might be a more tangible reason for this shift in discussion about Nurse. So that's why we're going to talk about the perceptual issue of being the best. Nurse is the strongest killer in the game. She has the highest skill ceiling, and because of that, she's the most attractive killer for competitive players. If Nurse got completely neutered and became pathetic, every competitively minded player who mains Nurse would switch to Blight. So then Blight would have to get nerfed. This pattern would continue and get uglier the further it went. Eventually we would get to Pyramid Head hard tunneling every match, then Twin slugging every match, then Bubba camping every match, and so on and so forth. Which does happen from time to time already, but it's not done by the sweatiest players in the game. Imagine if it was. So Nurse is the strongest killer, but she's also played by the best players. Because of that, you're always going to be making a trade when nerfing the strongest thing in the game, so just keep that in mind when making demands for changes. Believe it or not, there's another very common argument that the reason Behavior shifted away from smaller maps was only because Nurse was too strong on them. Can Nurse really impact the game design that significantly by herself? I suppose it is possible if they use her as a balance reference because she's the strongest killer. On the other hand, I don't believe Behavior is sitting there thinking, oh god, if only Nurse didn't exist, we could make significantly better maps for every other killer. So it might be true in one way, but I don't believe she's holding the entire map creation team hostage. In conclusion, I've read so many threads over the past week. I know there's 1,000 different opinions about Nurse, and to be honest, it seems like she's extremely hated. I'm not sure if it's a side effect of skill-based matchmaking or if this was just inevitable regardless. One thing is for sure though, the Nurse hate train seems to be escalating at an extreme rate, and my advice for Nurse mains is to enjoy her while you can. That said, I hope I offered some food for thought about the topic no matter what side of it you're on. Possibly the biggest issue in this entire discussion is that super efficient survive with friends that gen rush and play ultra safe can virtually beat any killer setup in the entire game no matter what. Let me know what you all think. Are any of the upcoming balance changes directly linked to Nurse, or do you think Behavior will stick to the statistics that say Nurse is the worst killer in the game? I'm curious what ideas you all have, and as always, thanks for watching and have a good one.